Some moments change your life forever. Not the loud ones, not the big announcements or the dramatic speeches, the quiet ones. The ones that happen in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday when you're tired and your coffee is cold and you're just trying to hold everything together. This is the story of a little girl named Poppy. She was 5 years old. She had 2 pigtails that never quite matched, a stuffed rabbit named Biscuit that she carried everywhere, and a laugh so contagious that strangers would smile without even knowing why. And she had a daddy. Just a daddy. No mom in the picture. Just the 2 of them against the whole world. Her daddy's name was Leland Pruitt, 34 years old. Former high school history teacher turned freelance curriculum writer. A man who drove a 2011 Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper, who made grocery lists on the backs of receipt paper, and read Poppy 2 bedtime stories every single night, no matter how exhausted he was. He was not rich. He was not powerful. He was not the kind of man who walked into rooms and made heads turn. But he loved his daughter with the kind of love that rearranges a person from the inside out. And that love, quiet, steady, and completely unremarkable to everyone who passed them on the street, was about to collide with something neither of them saw coming. Because on one Thursday morning in October, at a farmer's market in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina, a 5-year-old girl with mismatched pigtails and a stuffed rabbit named Biscuit looked up at a woman she had never met before, tugged on her daddy's sleeve, leaned up on her tiptoes, and whispered 4 words that would change everything. And the woman she was pointing at? She heard every single word. Let's go back. Because to understand what happened that Thursday morning, you need to understand what Leland Pruitt's life actually looked like. 3 years before this story begins, Leland was married. Her name was Deborah. She was clever, restless, and beautiful in the way that always made Leland feel like he'd gotten incredibly lucky. They met in their late 20s at a mutual friend's cookout. She'd argued with him about whether a hot dog was a sandwich, and he'd fallen in love somewhere between her second and third counterpoint. They got married. They moved into a rental house with a backyard big enough for a garden they never planted. They had Poppy. And for about 2 years, life was good. Not perfect. But good in the way that real life is good. Messy and complicated and full of small joys that you only appreciate in hindsight. Then Deborah got a job offer in Seattle. A big one. A real one. The kind she'd been working toward for years. And she took it. Now, I want to be careful here. Because this is not a story about a villain. Deborah was not evil. She was not cruel. She simply wanted something different than what she had. And she was honest about it in the end. Which, in some ways, made it worse. She sat Leland down one night after Poppy was asleep. She told him she wasn't happy, that she felt like she was disappearing inside their life, that she loved Poppy with everything she had, but she couldn't be the mother she wanted to be if she stayed. She cried. He cried. Poppy slept through the whole thing in the next room, holding Biscuit, when not knowing that her world was quietly splitting in 2. The divorce was as civil as 2 heartbroken people could manage. They agreed on joint custody in writing, but Deborah's work kept her in Seattle for longer and longer stretches. Visits became video calls. Video calls became shorter. And slowly, not all at once, but slowly, Poppy's day-to-day world became just Leland. Just Daddy. Leland didn't fall apart. He wanted to. Some nights, after Poppy was asleep and the house was quiet, and the weight of it all pressed down on his chest, he sat at the kitchen table and stared at nothing for a long time. But he didn't fall apart. He learned how to braid hair, Badly at first, then passably. He learned which brand of mac and cheese Poppy preferred, and which one she would politely push around the plate with her fork. But he learned that she was scared of the smoke detector beeping when the battery was low, that she didn't like socks with seams, and that she would always fall asleep faster if he sang the second verse of You Are My Sunshine in a slightly lower key. He became an expert in his daughter. And his daughter, in her 5-year-old wisdom, became an expert in him. She knew when Daddy was having a hard day before he said a word. She would climb into his lap, press her small hand to his cheek, and say, "It's okay, Daddy. I'm here." And every time, without fail, it was the one thing that actually helped. But here's the thing about being a single parent that no one talks about enough. It is lonely. Not lonely in the dramatic movie montage way. Lonely in the ordinary way. On the way where you sit at the pediatrician's office, and there's a form that says parent/guardian signature, with a line for a second signature, and you just leave it blank. The way where Poppy asks why her friend Kessa has a mommy who picks her up sometimes, and you don't have an answer good enough to give her. The way where it's 10 p.m., and you've just spent 45 minutes cleaning up spilled grape juice that's soaked under the refrigerator. And you just want one person to look at you and say, "You're doing okay." Leland hadn't been on a date in 2 years. He'd told himself it was because he was too busy, which was partially true. But it was also because the thought of opening himself up to someone again felt like trying to pick up a broken glass with bare hands. Possible, but likely to hurt. His sister Vonnie, who lived 20 minutes away and was his closest friend on earth, had started doing what sisters do, mentioning people. "Oh, you know who's recently single?" Dropping names. "You should come to my friend Patrice's dinner party," sending him unsolicited dating app screenshots. "Leland, just download it. Just look." He hadn't. He was fine. They were fine. He and Poppy were a team. That's what he told himself on the drive to the farmer's market that Thursday morning in October. He needed apples, some locally made honey that Poppy had become obsessed with, and if they were lucky, one of the vendors would have those cinnamon sugar almonds that Poppy loved. It was supposed to be a simple morning. It was not going to be a simple morning. Her name was Cassiel Thorne, and I want you to picture her the way the world saw her first. 38 years old. Tall, nearly 5'10". The kind of composed, unhurried stillness that comes not from arrogance, but from a woman who has spent a long time deciding exactly who she is and stopped apologizing for it. She wore a camel-colored coat and low boots that morning, her dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, and she was standing at the bread vendor's table with a canvas tote on her shoulder and the focused expression of someone who takes sourdough selection seriously. Cassiel Thorne was the founder and CEO of Thorne Capital Group, a private investment firm headquartered in Charlotte that managed nearly $4 billion in assets. She'd built it from a single deal at the age of 26, after walking away from a prestigious offer at a New York hedge fund, because she'd decided the culture was going to sand her down into something she didn't want to become. The bet had paid off. Handsomely. She owned 3 properties, a penthouse in uptown Charlotte, a lake house in the mountains of western North Carolina, and an apartment in New York she visited maybe 4 times a year. She had a sharp, loyal team, a personal assistant named Gus who could anticipate her needs with unsettling accuracy, and a board of directors who had learned that when Cassiel Thorne made a decision, you didn't push back unless you had ironclad data and a very good argument. She was not accustomed to being caught off guard. But here's what the business press didn't usually write about Cassiel Thorne. She came to this farmer's market every other Thursday morning. Not because her nutritionist recommended it, not because it was a networking opportunity, but because her mother, Celestine Thorne, had brought her here as a child. She'd passed away 4 years ago from a swift and devastating illness that had rearranged Cassiel's entire understanding of the world. Coming to this market, buying tomatoes from the same vendor her mother had always bought tomatoes from, picking up whatever local bread looked good. It was the closest thing she had to a ritual, to feeling like her mother wasn't entirely gone. She didn't talk about her mother much. She didn't talk about a lot of things. People who knew Cassiel in a business context thought they understood her. Focused, driven, controlled, not cold exactly, but contained. It was like a fire in a very well-built fireplace. What they didn't see was the late-night calls to her closest friend, Petra Vane, a pediatric surgeon based in Atlanta, where Cassiel would talk for hours about everything and nothing. They didn't see her sitting in the parking lot of her mother's old church on Sunday morning sometimes, not going in, just sitting. They didn't see the fact that her penthouse had exactly one photo displayed. Her mother at 60, laughing at something off camera, completely unaware she was being photographed. She was lonely, too. She just wore it differently. She had dated over the years. Interesting, accomplished people who understood the life that came with being with someone like her. But nothing had lasted. Something was always slightly off. Not with them, exactly. With her. Ours like a piece of furniture that was a beautiful object but never quite fit the room. Her assistant Gus had taken to giving her what he called the look, a specific face that communicated you have got to get out of your own way without saying a single word. Cassiel was not thinking about any of this on the Thursday morning in question. She was standing at the bread vendor's table, examining a sourdough loaf with the same level of focus she typically reserved for quarterly earnings reports. That was when she heard it. Not the whisper. Not yet. First she heard the laugh. A child's laugh. High and sudden and completely unself-conscious, the kind that bubbles up before the person even decides to let it happen. She looked up. Across the market aisle, maybe 15 feet away, but a little girl had just stepped directly into a puddle of her own making. She'd been carrying a sample cup of apple cider and had tipped it right onto the stone walkway. She was soaking wet from the knee down. And instead of crying, she was laughing. Laughing at herself. 2 pigtails, completely uneven. A stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. The most delighted expression on her face, as if being covered in apple cider was the funniest possible outcome. Behind her, a man was crouching down, pulling a small towel from a tote bag that also appeared to contain a second stuffed rabbit, a juice box, and what looked like a folded permission slip. He was laughing too, softly, shaking his head. "Poppy, we've had that cider for 30 seconds. It jumped, Daddy. I didn't spill it. It jumped." Cassiel found herself smiling before she'd decided to. She looked away, went back to the bread. But something made her glance back up 30 seconds later. And that was when the little girl, Poppy, looked directly at her. Children are honest in the way that adults have spent years unlearning. They see something, they say something. They feel something, they show it. They want something, they ask for it. The social machinery that teaches humans to suppress and filter and calculate hasn't fully installed yet. And sometimes, that means they say exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. Poppy was looking at Cassiel Thorne. She looked at her the way children look at things they find interesting, directly, without apology, head slightly tilted. She looked at her for a long moment. Or then she looked at her daddy, who was still fussing with the towel and didn't notice. Then she looked back at Cassiel. and she made up her mind. She tugged her father's sleeve. Leland looked down. "What is it, Pop?" She stretched up on her tiptoes. She always did this when she had something important to say, like she was trying to get closer to his ears, and she cupped her tiny hands around her mouth. And she whispered. Except she whispered the way 5-year-olds whisper, which is to say, not quietly at all. "Marry her, Daddy." Cassiel Thorne, who was 15 feet away, and had excellent hearing and had not actually moved, heard it as clearly as if the child had walked up and tapped her on the arm. There are moments in life where time does something strange, where everything slows down just slightly, like the universe is asking you to pay attention. This was one of those moments. Leland went completely still. He closed his eyes for 1 full second. Then he turned around, already composing an apology on his face, already preparing to explain his daughter's imagination, her complete lack of a filter. The fact that she had recently decided several inanimate objects would make good marriage partners for him, including their mailbox and a very large golden retriever at the park. He turned around and found himself looking at a woman who was already looking at him. She was tall, composed, wearing a camel coat, and her expression was not embarrassed or offended or cold. It was amused, with something softer underneath. Cassiel looked at the little girl first, then, slowly, at Leland. He opened his mouth to speak. She got there first. "Very strong recommendation," she said simply. And then, quietly, unexpectedly, she smiled. Leland blinked. Poppy beamed. Here is what was supposed to happen next. An awkward exchange, polite goodbyes, both of them going back to their respective mornings, the whole strange incident becoming a story Leland would tell his sister Vonnie over the phone that afternoon, while wincing. Here is what actually happened. Poppy pointed at the cider stand and said, "Can we get more? I promise I won't spill it this time." Leland said, "Absolutely not." Cassiel said, "I'll buy the next round." And somehow, in the way that small children sometimes architect entire situations through sheer force of will, Poppy had installed both adults at a picnic table at the edge of the market, each holding a cup of warm apple cider, while she sat between them eating a snickerdoodle that had materialized from the baker's table. Leland was not sure how this had happened. Cassiel was not entirely sure how this had happened either, which was notable, because Cassiel Thorne was generally a person who understood exactly how she ended up wherever she was. Poppy was completely sure how this had happened, and was extremely pleased about it. They talked. In the way that strangers sometimes talk when the normal social script gets thrown out. Not the weather, not careful small talk, but actual conversation. Maybe because the child had already said the most unexpected possible thing, and the weirdness budget for the morning had already been spent. Leland told her he was a curriculum writer. "I used to teach high school history, 10th grade. Then my wife and I split and I needed something more flexible, so..." He shrugged. "It pays the bills, mostly. I like it well enough." "What did you love about teaching?" Cassiel asked. Leland looked at her, slightly surprised by the specificity of the question. "The moment when something clicked for a kid," he said. "You know, when you could see it on their face, like someone would be completely lost on the causes of World War I, and then something I said would land, and their whole face would just open, like a window." He paused. "I miss that, honestly." "Why don't you go back?" "Single parent? The market doesn't make teacher salaries flexible enough for custody scheduling." He said it simply, without self-pity. Just a fact. The way people state facts about their lives when they've already done all their grieving about it. Cassiel nodded slowly. There was a pause. Poppy, who had finished her cookie, was now quietly reenacting something with Biscuit the rabbit that appeared to involve a great deal of drama and several sound effects. "What do you do?" Leland asked. "Investment firm. Private equity, mostly." "Okay." He said this neutrally. Then, "Big firm?" "Medium," said Cassiel. She said this without blinking. This was technically inaccurate. Her firm was not medium. But something about sitting at a picnic table next to a man who drove a cracked bumper Civic and kept a spare stuffed rabbit in his grocery tote made the full truth feel like showing up to a potluck with a catered spread. They talked for 45 minutes. They talked about Charlotte. Both had grown up nearby, though not in the same neighborhoods. Cassiel had grown up in a working-class family in Concord, 15 miles north. Her father had been an electrician. Her mother had worked at the county school board. People didn't always expect that, given who she'd become. She didn't announce it, but she didn't hide it either. Leland mentioned Vonnie. Cassiel mentioned her friend Petra. They discovered they both watched the same obscure British panel show that neither of them had ever met anyone else who watched. "You're kidding," said Leland. "Series 4 is the best one," said Cassiel. "Series 4 is objectively the best one," said Leland. Poppy looked between them with deep satisfaction. At some point during the conversation, Poppy fell asleep sitting upright between them. Biscuit clutched to her chest, head tilted sideways at an angle that should not have been comfortable. And there was something about watching a child trust you enough to fall asleep near you. Cassiel had always understood that, intellectually. She'd just never been on the receiving end of it. She found herself looking at Poppy's sleeping face, the small, completely unguarded peacefulness of it, and feeling something she hadn't been able to name in a long time. Something warm. Something that made the market noise and the cold October air feel very far away. Leland noticed her looking. "She does that," he said softly. "Just decides she's done and goes to sleep. Doesn't matter where." "She's remarkable," said Cassiel, and she meant it simply, not as a social nicety, as a real observation from someone who chose words carefully. Leland looked at his daughter for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "She really is." Eventually they had to go. But Leland had a call at noon. Poppy woke up and immediately asked for another cookie, was declined, and took this with reasonable grace. They were packing up, standing, doing the whole shuffle of a conversation coming to its end, when Cassiel said, without particularly planning to, "I'm here most Thursday mornings, if you ever come back." Leland looked at her for a moment. "We're usually here on Thursdays," he said. "Poppy likes the honey vendor." A pause. "So I'll probably see you," he said. "Probably," said Cassiel. Poppy, who had been listening to all of this very intently, looked up at Cassiel with enormous seriousness. "Bye, lonely lady," she said. Leland put his face in his hand. Cassiel laughed. Really laughed. Sudden and surprised and completely unguarded. The kind of laugh that looked like it hadn't gotten much practice lately. "Or bye, Poppy," she said. The next Thursday, Leland told himself he was going to the farmer's market because they were out of honey. This was true. They were out of honey. He did not examine the other reasons. Poppy had examined them for him, loudly, in the car on the way there. "Is Lonely Lady going to be there?" she asked. "Her name is Cassiel," Leland said. "That's a pretty name." "Don't call her Lonely Lady to her face, Poppy." "I already did. She laughed." "Don't do it again." "Why are you wearing the nice jacket?" "It's cold." "You have a warmer jacket." "Poppy." "I'm just saying, Daddy." He was wearing the nicer jacket. Cassiel was there, bread vendor again. Leland was beginning to understand this was simply where she started. She looked up when they came around the corner, and something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, not like the movies, just a slight easing, like a shoulder dropping from a position it had been held in for a long time. They fell into step together. Poppy walked between them and narrated everything she saw. "That dog is enormous. Daddy, can we get a dog? Daddy says our apartment is too small, but I said Biscuit wouldn't mind sharing. Cassiel, do you have a dog?" "I don't," said Cassiel. "Why?" "I'm not home enough." "That's sad." She processed this. "But you're here, so that's good." Cassiel looked across Poppy's head at Leland. Leland gave her a look that said, "I apologize in advance for everything she is about to say." Cassiel gave him a look back that said, "I find this completely charming," which she immediately arranged into something more neutral. This became the Thursday thing, not by agreement exactly, more by the accumulation of consecutive Thursdays where both of them simply showed up, and then walked through the market together, and then sat at the same picnic table, and then talked for longer than they probably should have given that both of them were technically there for groceries. Poppy was the constant. She held both their hands once, just grabbed them, one each, while she jumped over a crack in the sidewalk, and Leland felt something jolt through him that he absolutely refused to analyze. Cassiel started bringing things, not gifts exactly. More like she'd find something at the market that she thought they might like and simply have it when they arrived. A small jar of hot honey from a new vendor she'd discovered. A bread sample she'd set aside. "The baker said this is the last one for the day," she said, at which may or may not have been true. Leland started bringing coffee, a thermos with 2 cups, no mention of it. Just, "Here is coffee." The understanding was wordless, the kind that doesn't need explaining because explaining it would break it. They talked about everything over those weeks. Cassiel told Leland about her mother one morning, quietly, carefully, like something she had been carrying for a long time, and wasn't sure she should put down. She talked about how her mother used to say that money was just energy, that it went where you pointed it, and that you had to be careful what you pointed it at, or you'd end up wealthy and empty. She said she thought about that a lot. She said it, and then looked slightly surprised that she had said it. That she'd said it here, at a picnic table, onto a curriculum writer with a thermos of coffee and a sleeping child between them. Leland told her about Deborah. The whole of it, not the summary version. He described the night she told him, how the kitchen had smelled like the pasta they'd made for dinner, how the overhead light had seemed too bright. He described trying to explain to Poppy, at age 2, why Mama was somewhere else, how he'd mostly not been able to, how Poppy had eventually just accepted it, with the profound pragmatism of a small child who doesn't yet know how much to be devastated. "She never cried about it," Leland said. "That was the hardest part. I think she would have had an easier time if she had." Cassiel was quiet for a moment. "Or," she said carefully, "she had you. And that was enough that she didn't need to." Leland stared at his coffee cup. "And I think about all the things she's missing," he said. "All the things I can't give her." "What things?" Leland spread his hands. "Someone else to talk to. A different perspective. Another voice in the room. I try, but I'm her dad. There are going to be things she needs that aren't me." Cassiel nodded slowly. "She has you," she said again. "You'd be surprised how far that goes." Something about the way she said it made Leland think there was a personal dimension there. He didn't ask, but he filed it away. On the 6th Thursday, Poppy fell asleep again. Same way, just decided she was done, curled sideways in her seat, biscuit under her chin. Leland and Cassiel sat in the comfortable silence that had developed between them. The market moved around them. People passed. "Can I ask you something?" Cassiel said. Sure. Are you happy?" Leland looked at her. "Right now?" he said. "Actually, yeah, I am." He hadn't planned to say it like that. But it was true. Right now, at this picnic table, with his daughter asleep and the October air cool and sharp, and this unexpected woman sitting across from him, he was genuinely, quietly happy. Cassiel held his gaze. "Good," she said simply. "Here is the thing about being Cassiel Thorne. Your private life is not, technically, very private. Not because she invited attention. She actively avoided it. She didn't do personal social media. She turned down the magazine profiles her PR team occasionally suggested. She was, for a woman of her prominence in Charlotte's business world, remarkably difficult to photograph in candid settings. But 6 consecutive Thursday mornings at the same farmer's market, with the same man and the same child, was eventually going to be noticed by someone. That someone turned out to be a financial journalist named Oswald Fry, who wrote for a local business vertical and happened to live in the neighborhood. He had excellent eyes and an excellent memory. He'd seen Cassiel Thorne at the market before. Alone, bred, quick departure. Now he was seeing her sitting at a picnic table, laughing at something the man across from her had said, with a small child asleep against her arm. He didn't publish anything. He was not that kind of journalist. But he mentioned it to a colleague who ran a gossip-adjacent newsletter about Charlotte's business community. And that colleague ran a small item with no names. A certain well-known investment firm founder has been seen at the farmer's market in an unexpectedly domestic scene. Recurring visits, adorable child involved. It was nothing. 6 sentences. But Cassiel's assistant, Gus, saw it, because Gus saw everything, and he mentioned it to her with precisely calibrated discretion. "There's a small item. You might want to know." Cassiel read it. She was quiet for a moment. "It's not inaccurate," she said, and handed it back. Gus waited. "He's a curriculum writer," she added. "Former history teacher, single dad. His daughter thinks I look lonely." "Does she?" said Gus. "Said it to my face, first meeting." Gus gave her the look. The specific one. The "you have got to get out of your own way" look. Cassiel saw it. "Don't." "I didn't say anything." "You were about to. I was going to ask if you needed anything before your 3 o'clock. Cassiel looked at him for a long moment. "She's right," she said quietly. "The kid." "She usually is," said Gus. "Kids generally are." Meanwhile, Leland's sister Vonnie had noticed the jacket situation. Vonnie Pruitt-Haas was 37 years old, taught kindergarten, had been married for 9 years to a man named Ferris Haas, a good man who made excellent chili and laughed at her jokes even when they weren't funny, which is genuinely one of the best things a spouse can do. Vonnie had watched her brother for 3 years. She had watched him rebuild himself from the inside out. She had watched him make breakfast and braid hair and write curriculum and pretend he was fine when he was not entirely fine. She had loved him through all of it, imperfectly but persistently. When he told her about the Thursday market thing, he'd been casual about it. "There's a woman Poppy likes. We've been running into her. She's fine." Vonnie had looked at him. "She's fine?" she repeated. "Normal. Smart." "Who is she?" "Works in finance." "What's her name?" "Cassiel." Vonnie's eyes had gotten very slightly wider. "As in Cassiel Thorne?" Leland paused. "I didn't ask her last name." "Lee, Google her." Leland had not Googled her. He'd told himself it would feel strange, digging into someone's background because of a farmer's market friendship. He'd Googled her that night. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time afterward, because it turned out that Cassiel Thorne was not medium. Her firm managed $4 billion. She had been on the covers of business magazines. She owned a penthouse in uptown Charlotte that, based on the listing price when it had sold, cost more than Leland would earn in 20 lifetimes of curriculum writing. He stared at his screen. He thought about the woman he knew at the farmer's market, who brought hot honey and listened carefully and laughed at Poppy's observations and had said, without any apparent calculation, "She's not wrong," when a 5-year-old called her lonely. He thought about the gap between those two things. He put his phone down, and then he picked it up and texted Vonnie. "Did not realize. Not sure what to do with this." Vonnie texted back almost immediately. "You don't have to do anything with it. Just don't make it weird." And then, "Also, what does she look like?" Then, "I'm asking for science." Leland put his phone face down on the table. The 7th Thursday came. Leland almost didn't go, not because he didn't want to, but because he'd spent a week thinking too hard about the Google results, about the gap, about what it actually meant that he looked forward to Thursday mornings the way he hadn't looked forward to anything in a very long time, about whether that meant something he wasn't ready to deal with. Poppy settled the debate in the car by saying, "Daddy, we're going to the market, right? With the honey and Cassiel?" in a tone that was not entirely a question. "Yeah," he said. "We're going." Cassiel was there. Bread. Same starting position. But something was different this week. She had brought someone with her. A woman about her age. Quick-eyed, warm, was wearing a Georgetown medical sweatshirt and the kind of easy confidence that came from spending years in hospital environments where you had to be steady. She was looking at the vegetable stalls when Leland and Poppy came around the corner, and she turned at their approach and smiled with the bright, evaluating smile of someone who has been told something and is now verifying it in person. "This is Petra," Cassiel said. "She's visiting from Atlanta." Leland shook Petra Vane's hand. He had the distinct and slightly uncomfortable feeling of being assessed with great warmth. "Poppy," said Petra, crouching down. "I've heard about you." Poppy looked at her with frank interest. "Did Cassiel tell you I said she was lonely?" "She did," said Petra. "And for what it's worth, you were completely right." Poppy nodded, deeply satisfied. Petra Vane was one of those people who could make anyone feel like an old friend inside 20 minutes. She was funny and perceptive and smart in the specific way of someone who has spent years in pediatric medicine. She'd seen enough to have genuine compassion and had decided early on that warmth was the most efficient delivery system for it. She and Leland talked easily. Curriculum writing led to education policy, which led to Petra's work with children during long hospitalizations, and the gaps in learning that followed. By the time they'd made it to the picnic table, they were deep in a conversation about something Leland had written 2 years ago for a home learning supplement. Cassiel sat across from him and watched him talk. Poppy had climbed into Petra's lap within 10 minutes because she had no concept of personal space with people she immediately liked, and Petra was narrating Biscuit's internal monologue in a dramatic voice that was making Poppy laugh. Cassiel watched Leland laugh at something Petra said, and something settled in her chest, and simultaneously something ached there, which is a confusing combination of feelings that she had no efficient framework for. Later, when Leland took Poppy to the restroom at the far end of the market, Petra looked at Cassiel. Okay, she said. Don't, said Cassiel. I'm just saying. He is exactly Petra. The kind of person you would have described if I'd asked you to describe someone, and you would have immediately said, that person doesn't exist. Cassiel looked across the market. And he doesn't know, she said. Doesn't know what? What this is. She gestured vaguely at the table. At the thermos of coffee that was already there, because Leland had arrived first that morning. It's Thursday mornings. I don't know that I have the right to decide it's something more than that. Petra looked at her for a long moment. Cass, you researched sourdough varieties because he once mentioned she prefers a lighter crumb. The baker mentioned, you told me the baker. You did not mention this detail to the baker. Cassiel said nothing. You're in trouble, said Petra. Really wonderful trouble. When Leland came back, Poppy was asleep again. She'd crashed mid-return journey, and Leland was carrying her, her head on his shoulder, biscuit dangling from her loose hand. Cassiel stood automatically. Just stood. And reached out, and without thinking, and steadied the arm Leland was using to hold Poppy. A brief, reflexive gesture of steadiness. Leland looked at her. A moment passed between them. Neither said anything. Petra looked at her cider cup with extraordinary focus. The following Tuesday, not a Thursday, not the market, Cassiel Thorne did something she almost never did. She called first. Leland had given her his number on the third Thursday, logistically, in case they missed each other. She had texted twice. Once to confirm a vendor she'd mentioned. Once to send a link to the British panel show she'd been trying to remember the episode of. She had not called. She called. Leland picked up on the third ring, slightly surprised. He was in the middle of editing a unit on the civil rights movement. Cassiel? Everything okay? Yes. A pause. I wanted to ask you something, and I thought it would be strange to wait until Thursday. Leland set his pencil down. There's a concert, she said. At the Belk Theater, Saturday. A string quartet. They're doing a program of early American music. It reminded me of something you said once about history having a sound. I thought... She stopped, started again, more directly. I wanted to ask if you'd like to go. With me. Silence. Is this... Leland started. Yes, said Cassiel, quietly and clearly. That's what this is, if that's something you'd like. Leland sat very still in his kitchen. He thought about the jacket. He thought about the coffee thermos. He thought about the way she had stood automatically when he came back carrying Poppy. But he thought about the Google results and the gap and all the reasons this was probably complicated, and all the reasons that none of that was actually the point. He thought about what Poppy had said on that very first Thursday. Marry her daddy. 5 years old. First look. No hesitation. I'll have to get Vonnie to watch Poppy, he said. Of course. She's going to ask me 20 questions. Vonnie? Both of them. Vonnie about logistics, Poppy about everything else. Cassiel made a sound that was almost a laugh. And? Leland looked out his kitchen window at the early November dark. And I'll see you Saturday, he said. He told Poppy the next morning over breakfast that he was going out with Cassiel on Saturday. Poppy put her spoon down with great ceremony. She looked at him with enormous gravity. Like a date? She asked. Yeah, said Leland. Like a date. Poppy picked her spoon back up and returned to her cereal with the satisfied air of someone who has won a very long and important argument. Good, she said simply. I told you. The Belk Theater in Charlotte is a beautiful building, high ceilings, good acoustics, the kind of space that takes ordinary sound and gives it somewhere to go. Leland arrived slightly early. He was wearing the nice jacket. Cassiel was already there. She'd been there for 12 minutes, which was something she would not mention. She was standing in the lobby, and she looked at him when he came through the door with an expression of relief, like some part of her had quietly braced for him not to come. They had a drink at the lobby bar before the show. Sparkling water, because Cassiel didn't drink much and Leland was driving. Yeah, and neither of them mentioned this. They just both ordered the same thing simultaneously, and then laughed at the matching choice, a little of the first date tension releasing with it. It was, in a lot of ways, an ordinary first date. The slight adjusting to each other's presence in a new context. The awareness of intention that Thursday mornings hadn't carried. But it was also not ordinary at all. Because they already knew each other. They had 6 weeks of Thursday mornings. They had each other's coffee preferences and the British panel show and the conversation about Leland's mother-in-law and Cassiel's mother, and they had Poppy, who had decided for both of them weeks ago and was currently at Vonnie's house demanding a movie and almost certainly reporting the situation in real time. The music was extraordinary. Early American, folk melodies arranged for strings, some of it mournful, and some of it so alive it felt almost aggressive. Leland, who had said once that history had a sound, sat absolutely still through most of it. At one point his eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it, just took a quiet breath, and kept listening. Cassiel noticed. She didn't say anything. But at some point in the second half, in the dark of the concert hall, her hand moved across the armrest between them and found his. She didn't ask permission. His hand turned over without being asked. And they sat like that for the rest of the program. Afterward, outside on the sidewalk, the November air cold and clear, and the city lit up around them, Leland said, "I Googled you a few weeks ago." Cassiel looked at him. "I know." "You know? You were quieter for about a week. I figured." Leland let out a slow breath. "Cassiel, you have $4 billion. The firm manages $4 billion. I have less than that." That is not a reassuring distinction. "I know." A pause. "I was going to say something to you about it," Leland said. "About how this doesn't make sense. The gap." "What gap?" He gestured at himself. At the Civic parked 2 blocks over. The curriculum writing. The tote bag with the spare stuffed rabbit. "There's no gap," Cassiel said. "Cassiel, there's no gap that matters." Her voice was quiet, but completely certain. "I sat at a picnic table with you for 6 weeks, and none of that was in the room. I was just thinking about you, about how you look at your daughter, about how you said history has a sound, and I had never heard anyone put it like that. And I couldn't stop thinking about it after you said it, about how you make coffee for 2 without announcing it or making it a thing." Leland was quiet. "My father was an electrician," she said. "My mother worked at the county school board. I built something from nothing, and I'm proud of it. But I am not a different category of person than you. I'm a woman who has been lonely for a long time, standing on a sidewalk in November, asking you to consider not letting the other thing be what stops this." "You have no idea," Leland said quietly, "how long it's been since someone asked me to consider something." Cassiel looked at him steadily. "Poppy saw it," he said. 5 years old. First look. He shook his head. "She does that, and she sees things. She's remarkable. She's going to be insufferable about being right." "Probably," said Cassiel. "Let her." They walked to his car. 2 blocks in the cold. No rush. At the car, Leland said, "Same time Thursday?" Cassiel said, "Same time Thursday." And then, because it was the most natural possible thing, Leland stepped forward and Cassiel met him halfway, and it was brief and quiet, and felt like something being settled after a very long negotiation. Things did not go perfectly after that. They wouldn't have been real if they had. There was the December morning when Cassiel's board called an emergency meeting on a Thursday, and she couldn't make it, and Leland showed up at the market and stood there in the cold for 20 minutes before checking his phone and finding her message. He felt an irrational wash of disappointment that embarrassed him, because he was 34 years old and not a teenager. He texted back, "It's fine. Poppy is upset about the honey situation." She texted back, "I'll make it up to Poppy." And then, a moment later, separately, "I'm sorry I wasn't there." There was the night in January when Leland called, not texted, called, because Poppy had woken up with a fever of 103, and he'd gotten her to urgent care and she was fine. It was just an ear infection, but he'd been sitting in that waiting room alone at midnight and needed to hear a voice. Cassiel answered on the first ring. She stayed on the phone for an hour and a half. She offered quietly to come. Leland said, "It's fine. She's going to be okay." And Cassiel said, "I know. I still want to be there." And Leland said, "Next time." And Cassiel said, "Okay, next time." And she meant it in the way that people mean things when they're not performing them. There was the conversation they needed to have, the important one, the real one, about what Poppy's life would actually look like if this continued. Because she was 5, and she noticed everything, and she had already started asking questions that made it clear she understood this was different from Daddy's other friendships. Leland sat Cassiel down one Saturday afternoon in February at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd stared at Google results months ago. And he said, "I need you to think about whether you actually want this, not the idea of it, the actual thing. Because Poppy is going to get attached. She's already attached. And if you decide somewhere down the road that this was a Thursday morning thing and not a life thing, it won't just hurt me, it'll hurt her. And I can absorb a lot of things. I can't absorb watching her lose someone else." The room was quiet. Cassiel held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for a promise about forever. I'm asking if you've actually thought about what you're choosing." "I've thought about little else since October," she said. "I'm not someone who does things halfway. My therapist has pointed this out as both a strength and a liability, but in this case I think it works in your favor." She looked at him directly. "I'm choosing this. I want to be in her life. I want to be in yours. I understand what that means. I'm not walking anything back." Leland looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay? Yeah." A breath. "Okay." She looked at them both. She looked at the table. She looked at their faces with the unerring radar of a child who can read a room. "Did you make up?" she asked. "We weren't fighting," Leland said. "You were doing the face," she said. "The one where you're trying to figure something out." She climbed into a chair between them, entirely unbothered. "I think," she said with considerable authority for someone who had been asleep 4 minutes ago, "that you should stop figuring it out and just do it." Cassiel looked at her. "Do what, exactly?" Poppy picked up a stray crayon from the table and began drawing on her placemat, thoroughly done with them. "Be happy," she said simply. "It's not that hard." It turns out in some ways it wasn't. October again. A Thursday, the farmer's market. Same vendors, mostly. And though a new one had set up near the entrance selling small batch olive oil, and Cassiel had already bought 3 bottles because she had deeply specific opinions about olive oil that Leland found both excessive and completely endearing. Poppy was 6 now. She had graduated from mismatched pigtails to a single braid she'd mostly learned to do herself, with variable success. Biscuit the rabbit was still present, but had been joined by a second stuffed rabbit named Toast, who was apparently Biscuit's cousin. She walked between Leland and Cassiel, holding both their hands. She swung them slightly as she walked, in the way children do when they are in possession of the world. "Remember," she said, "when I told you to marry her, Daddy?" Leland closed his eyes briefly. "How could I forget? On Poppy. And then you did." She stated this with complete matter-of-fact satisfaction, the way someone might note that the sun rose this morning, as expected. "We're not married," Leland said. "Yet," she said. Cassiel made a sound that was part cough, part laugh, and mostly something else entirely. Leland looked over Poppy's head at her. Cassiel met his eyes. There was something in her expression, unhurried, certain, completely settled. The look of a woman who was exactly where she'd decided to be. "She's not wrong," Cassiel said. Leland stared at her. "Yet?" he said. She raised her eyebrows slightly, not as a question, as a statement. Poppy looked up between them with the expression of someone watching the final confirmation of a prediction she made 14 months ago in a farmer's market aisle, holding a soggy, stuffed rabbit. "I'm completely certain." "See?" she said simply. She gave their hands one more swing and kept walking. "I told you. Some moments change your life forever. Not the loud ones, not the announcements or the speeches, the quiet ones, a farmer's market in October, a spilled cup of apple cider, a 5-year-old girl with mismatched pigtails and a stuffed rabbit named Biscuit, and the unfiltered honesty that children carry like a superpower before the world teaches them to put it down." She looked at a stranger across a crowded market. She saw something, and she pointed. Leland Pruitt didn't fix his life that Thursday morning. He didn't suddenly have everything figured out. He still drove the Civic with the cracked bumper. He still made grocery lists on the backs of receipt paper. He still had hard nights and long days, and all the ordinary weight of being a person doing their best with what they had. But he wasn't doing it alone anymore. Cassiel Thorne, for her part, still went to the market on Thursday mornings. She still bought bread from the same vendor her mother had loved. She still carried that grief like something precious and irreplaceable, but now she carried it in the company of people who had made space for it. A man who brought coffee without making it a thing. A little girl who looked at her on the very first day and saw clearly and immediately exactly what was there. And Poppy. Poppy was right. She was right that Thursday in October, and she was right every Thursday after that. And she would almost certainly be right about things no one could yet predict, because that is what remarkable children do. Sometimes love doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it doesn't arrive with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it arrives on an ordinary Thursday morning at a picnic table in the sound of someone else's laugh at your daughter's honesty. And sometimes the person who sees it clearest is 5 years old, holding a soggy stuffed rabbit, pointing at a stranger, absolutely certain. Thanks for watching Crest Stories. If this one got to you, and I have a feeling it did, go ahead and hit that like button and leave us a comment. Tell us about a moment someone in your life saw something you couldn't see yet. The small moments. The quiet ones. Subscribe if you haven't already. We put out stories every day. the kind that remind you that real life is full of the things that matter most. We'll see you in the next one.